They tried to
What is he
silence the
doing?
little
I don't know,
black
he won't
boy on the
respond.
plane.
Something is wrong.
Then everything changed. ACD1. She said it like he wasn't even a person. Like he was background noise. Like he was an inconvenience wrapped in a hoodie, sitting in seat 24B, taking up space that apparently needed to be quieter. And he just looked at her. No tears. No trembling lip. No reaching for his mother's hand in panic. Just this steady, calm, almost ancient kind of stillness that you don't expect from a child. That you don't expect from most adults, honestly. His name was Malik Johnson. 8 years old. Window seat. Small enough that his sneakers barely touched the floor when he sat back all the way. He had his hands folded in his lap, like somebody had taught him exactly how to hold himself when the world got loud around him. And the world, on this particular Tuesday afternoon at 31,000 feet somewhere over the middle of the United States, had gotten very loud. The flight attendant's name was Heather Collins. She wasn't a villain. That's important to understand right from the start, because this story isn't about villains. It's about something far more uncomfortable than that. It's about the way ordinary people make ordinary assumptions, and how those assumptions, stacked one on top of another like cards in a house, can build something tall enough to hurt somebody. Heather had been working flights for 11 years. She knew the rhythms of a cabin the way a musician knows a song. She could read a row in 3 seconds. Sleeping business traveler, anxious first-timer, couple quietly not speaking to each other, family with too much carry-on. She was good at her job, efficient, professional, and right now, she was standing in the aisle of a Boeing 737 somewhere over the heartland, looking down at this little boy, and the look on her face said something her mouth hadn't said yet. She had already said, "Sweetie, you need to keep your voice down." She had already said, "Other passengers are trying to rest." And she had said it the way adults say things to children when they've already decided the child's words don't carry weight. That particular tone, polite enough to be deniable, firm enough to be a wall. And Malik had looked up at her, not with defiance, not with attitude, just with this quiet, clear-eyed composure. And he had said something that made the entire row go still. He had said, "I understand, but I think you should listen." For words after, "I understand." 11 words total. And something about the way he said them, the steadiness, the certainty underneath the politeness, made the woman in 23 A stop pretending to look at her phone. Made the man in 25C slowly lower his newspaper. Made Danielle Johnson, sitting right next to her son, press her lips together very gently, because she knew. She already knew. She had always known. In the back of row 25, a man in a charcoal blazer glanced over the top of his laptop screen. Victor Reynolds, senior partner at a logistics firm out of Chicago. Man who had logged more air miles in the last 3 years than most people drive in a lifetime. Man who had opinions about efficiency, about professionalism, about the proper management of disruptions in shared spaces. He looked at the Johnson family. He looked at Heather. He looked back at his laptop. And he made a decision about what kind of situation this was. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. None of them did, except Malik. Malik, who sat with his hands folded and his eyes steady and his mind running quietly through everything he had noticed since they boarded. Every small, strange, slightly off thing that adults had walked right past, because adults so often have learned to stop paying attention to the things that feel small. The thing about wisdom is it doesn't come with a height requirement. The thing about awareness is it doesn't check your age at the door. And the thing about this flight, this ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday afternoon flight from Gate C, 14 to wherever it was supposed to land, is that it was about to become the kind of flight that nobody on board would ever fully stop thinking about. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand what happened at 31,000 feet, you need to understand what happened on the ground. You need to understand who Malik Johnson was before Heather Collins told him to lower his voice. And you need to understand what he saw. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we tell stories on this channel that stay with you. And this one? This one is going to stay with you for a long time. Let's go. Before we go further, drop a comment right now. Have you ever been in a situation where someone dismissed what you were saying before you even finished? Tell me what that felt like. I read every single one. Airplane Act 2. Danielle Johnson had booked this flight 6 weeks ago on a Tuesday night, sitting at the kitchen table after Malik went to bed, with a cup of tea she forgot to drink while it was hot. She had stared at the confirmation email for a long time after she clicked purchase. Not because of the price, though the price was real and it had required some rearranging, but because of what the trip meant, because of where they were going and why. Because some journeys aren't really about the destination at all. They're about the courage it takes to make the decision to go. Danielle's mother had been sick. Not suddenly sick. The kind of sick that comes quietly, that settles and slowly, that give you enough time to think about all the things you should have said and done and visited and called about, while simultaneously making it harder and harder to actually do any of those things because the weight of it is so enormous. Danielle had grown up in a complicated relationship with her own family. The kind where love was absolutely present, but expression was harder, where distance had accumulated not from cruelty, but from silence, from the particular way that certain families move through hard things by moving around them instead of through them. Her mother lived across the country. They spoke on the phone, more in the last year as her mother's health declined than in the several years before it. And finally, after a conversation in early spring where her mother's voice had sounded more tired than usual, Danielle had said, "Mama, we're coming. Malik and me, we're coming to see you." And her mother had gone quiet in that way. That meant she was trying not to cry. So this flight mattered. This wasn't a vacation. This wasn't a work trip. This was Danielle Johnson taking her son to see her mother while there was still time, still voice, still hands to hold. She had packed carefully. She had prepped Malik carefully too, because Malik was the kind of child who processed big emotional things by getting very quiet and very observant, and she wanted to make sure he was ready for what seeing his grandmother might look and feel like. They had talked about it over dinner the week before. Malik had asked good questions, thoughtful questions. He had always been like that. Teachers had been saying it since he was 5. Malik notices things. Malik asks questions other kids don't think to ask. Malik was the first one who figured out why the classroom thermometer wasn't working correctly. He'd been watching it for 2 weeks. His second-grade teacher had called Danielle in after school specifically to tell her, "Your son has an extraordinary capacity for observation. He doesn't miss things." Danielle had smiled and said thank you and driven home knowing it was true, knowing it had always been true. Malik had been noticing things since before he had the language to describe what he was noticing. He used to sit in the shopping cart as a toddler and watch the store around him with this deep, concentrated attention, not restless, not distracted, just collecting information, processing, filing it away. By the time he was 8, he had gotten very good at that process, which is why, when they boarded Flight 2247 that morning, Malik noticed things before anyone else did. It started at the gate. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would set off any kind of alarm. Just a small thing. A sound. The kind of faint mechanical irregularity that you'd have to be very still and very quiet and paying very specific attention to notice at all. It happened twice while they were waiting at the gate, when the jet bridge made its settling sounds and the gate agent was talking to a family about carry-on sizes and everyone else was on their phones or eating airport food. Malik had heard it. He'd looked up from the book he was reading, a book about deep-sea creatures, his current obsession, and he'd looked toward the plane. Then he'd looked back at his book, but the page didn't get read. He was listening now. Then they boarded. And the process of boarding an airplane, for most adults, is a process of survival. Get your bag in the overhead. Find your seat. Figure out the armrest situation. Settle in and begin the psychological transition from the ground to the air that humans still haven't entirely made peace with after more than 100 years of flight. Malik boarded and did none of that. He was watching the cabin crew. He was watching the way the attendants moved. He was watching Heather specifically, who had welcomed them aboard with a practice smile at the door and was now moving through the cabin with quick, efficient competence, checking overheads, answering questions, doing her job. He was watching the overhead bins near the galley at the back of their section. He was watching the ventilation panel near row 22. He was watching the floor, and he had asked his mother a question, quietly, as they got settled. A question that Danielle had answered automatically without fully registering its specificity. because she was organizing their bags and thinking about her mother and processing the thousand small things that parents process while simultaneously appearing to be doing only one thing. Malik had asked, "Mom, is it normal for the air to smell a little different in different parts of the plane?" And Danielle had said, "I don't know, baby, probably. Planes are big." And Malik had nodded, slowly. The way he nodded when the answer he got wasn't quite the answer to the question he was actually asking. The passengers around them settled into their seats and into their routines. Victor Reynolds opened his laptop 2 rows back and immediately began scrolling through something with the focused intensity of a man who viewed idle time as a personal failure. Mrs. Alvarez, a woman in her mid-30s with kind, tired eyes and a toddler named Benny who was already wriggling against his seatbelt, settled into row 23 and began the complex negotiation process of keeping a 2-year-old content in a tight space for what would be a 3-hour flight. Heather Collins came through with a beverage cart. She was pleasant. She was quick. She was professional. She looked at the Johnson family the way she looked at every family. Quick assessment, no lingering. She was good at her job, but she didn't look the way Malik had been looking, because Malik, somewhere between the gate and 31,000 feet, had noticed 3 things. 3 separate, small, easily dismissible things that, taken together, pointed toward one thing. One thing that nobody else on that plane had noticed yet. He thought about whether to say something. That's the part people don't understand about observant children. They're not impulsive. They don't just blurt. They think about whether they'll be heard. They think about whether the adult they're speaking to is open or closed. They think about whether the words they have are the right words for the moment. Malik had been doing that calculation his whole life. He usually got it right. He hoped he'd get it right today. If you're watching this and you've got a perceptive kid in your life, the quiet one who notices everything, make sure you're subscribed because this story is about to show you exactly what happens when we decide to listen to those kids and what happens when we don't. Comment right now and tell me, do you think kids notice more than adults? Or do adults just have more context for what they're seeing? Real talk, let's discuss. Warning Act 3. The plane had been in the air for 47 minutes when Malik spoke to Heather Collins for the first time. And I want you to notice that number. 47 minutes. He had been sitting with this thing, this collection of small observations, this quiet, accumulating concern, for 47 minutes through takeoff, through the drink service, through the pilot's cheerful announcement about cruising altitude and expected arrival time, through Victor Reynolds' phone calls that were supposed to end at takeoff but somehow lasted through climb. 47 minutes. For a child. That's patience. That's not impulsivity. That's not seeking attention. That's a kid who is genuinely trying to figure out the right moment, the right approach, the right words. He got Danielle's attention first. "Mom, quiet." His book closed on his lap. She was reading something on her phone, a message from her sister about logistics at the other end. "I want to talk to the flight attendant about something." They made her look up. She looked at his face. She had learned, over 8 years, to read the specific frequency of his concern. The difference between Malik worried about nothing and Malik worried about something real. This landed somewhere she couldn't quite calibrate. His face was too steady to be dismissed, too careful to be panic. "What is it?" she asked. He told her. He told her the 3 things. And to Danielle's credit, to her enormous credit, because this is where the story could have gone differently very easily, she listened to all 3 before she responded. The first thing was the smell. Faint, only in specific rows. Slightly chemical in a way that didn't match what aircraft cabins usually smelled like. She had said, "Planes are big," at the gate, and now she was taking that back internally, because the specificity with which Malik was describing it was not the specificity of a child making something up. The second thing was a sound, intermittent, coming from the direction of the overhead compartment area near row 22, close to the forward galley of their section. Not mechanical grinding, not a loud alarm. A small, repeating, slightly inconsistent sound that Malik described as like when the refrigerator at home is trying to start but can't quite. The third thing was what he had seen during boarding. One of the overhead bin panels near that galley, not fully flush with the ceiling, just slightly, just enough that if you weren't specifically looking at panels, you wouldn't notice. But Malik had been specifically looking. Danielle sat with this for a moment. She was not a mechanical engineer. She was not an aviation expert. She was a 34-year-old woman trying to get to her sick mother and managing her own anxiety about that trip. And now her 8-year-old son was sitting next to her with this collection of observations that she didn't have the technical vocabulary to evaluate. She did what a careful parent does. She waited. She thought about whether to dismiss it, and she didn't because she knew Malik, and she thought about whether to escalate it, and she decided, yes. Talk to someone. It's probably nothing, but talk to someone. Okay, she said. We can ask. When Heather came back through the aisle, Danielle caught her attention. Politely. No urgency in her voice because she didn't want to alarm the surrounding passengers, and she wasn't actually alarmed herself. She was being cautious, which is a different thing. Excuse me, she said. I'm sorry to bother you. My son noticed a couple of things that he wanted to mention. I know it's probably nothing, but... Of course, Heather said. The professional smile. The practiced openness. And Malik explained. He used clear words. He was specific without being overly technical. He pointed toward row 22. He described the sound as best he could, and Heather listened. For about 45 seconds, which sounds like a long time, but is actually the length of time it takes to appear to be listening while your face is doing something slightly different from what your ears are doing. And what Heather's face was doing was a very small, very professional, very unconscious recalibration. The one that happens when the source of information doesn't match the expectation of the information. Because here's the thing about Heather Collins. And I want to be careful here, because Heather is not the villain. Heather was a good flight attendant, and by most measures a good person. But Heather had a framework. 11 years of flying gives you frameworks. And the framework that Heather's brain pulled up when an 8-year-old boy in a hoodie started describing mechanical irregularities in quiet, specific language was not this child may have noticed something important. The framework was different from that. It was quieter, more automatic, the kind of bias that doesn't announce itself as bias. It just shows up as a slightly faster conclusion, a slightly shorter patience for the full explanation, a slightly firmer delivery of the response. Sweetie, Heather said, and that word, sweetie, carried something that her professional tone almost successfully masked. These sounds and smells you're describing are completely normal on an aircraft. Planes make a lot of different sounds, and the ventilation system can create different air pressures in different sections that can affect how things smell a little bit. It's nothing to worry about. She said it to Malik, but she had looked at Danielle about 2/3 of the way through. The look that adults exchange over children's heads. The look that says, we both know this is fine, right? And Danielle, who was managing so much, who was trying to keep peace, who was already emotionally full from the weight of this trip and its destination, gave a very small nod. The nod that means, I hear you. Maybe you're right. Malik looked at his mother. He looked at Heather. I understand, he said, but I think you should listen. And that right there was the moment. The cold, open moment. The moment the row went still and Victor looked up and the entire cabin energy shifted by just a fraction. Because something about the way he said it. Not, but I know I'm right. Not, but you're wrong. I think you should listen. There's a difference. A significant difference. And some part of every adult in that nearby section registered it, even if they couldn't have articulated why. Heather stood up a little straighter. I appreciate you sharing that, she said, which is what you say when you're done listening. And she moved down the aisle. Victor Reynolds, 2 rows back, watch her go. Then he looked at the little boy who had spoken so precisely, so calmly, so without drama. Victor was a man who built his career on reading situations efficiently. He had been wrong before, rarely, in his estimation, but the wrongness had always come from acting on incomplete information. He had the thought, briefly, what if the information is incomplete? Then his phone buzzed with an email, and he looked at his screen, and the thought dissolved. And Malik turned back to his window. The plane hummed around him. The ventilation moved air through the cabin in its invisible currents. Victor typed. Mrs. Alvarez negotiated with Benny over a juice box. Danielle rubbed gentle circles on Malik's back and said softly, You did good, baby. You said something. He nodded, but he was still listening. He was always still listening. And the sound near row 22, that small, irregular, slightly off sound, had not stopped. We don't always know, in the moment, which voices to trust. Sometimes we get so comfortable with the frameworks we've built that we stop questioning whether the framework fits the situation. And sometimes, the voice that doesn't fit the framework is the one we needed to hear. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're just getting to the part where everything accelerates. You do not want to miss what comes next. Here's your question for this act. Have you ever tried to warn someone about something and been dismissed and then been proven right? What did that moment of vindication feel like? Tell me in the comments. ACT 4. The turbulence started at the 1 hour and 12-minute mark. Light at first, the kind that makes drinks wobble and reminds you that you are, in fact, in a metal tube traveling at 500 miles per hour through the atmosphere, which is not a thing the human body was designed for, and which your brain will periodically send you small memos about. The seatbelt sign came on. The pilot's voice came through, easy, routine, the particular cadence of experienced pilots who have learned that their tone of voice is itself a communication to passengers. This was the tone that said, "This is normal. We do this all the time. No revision to your plans." Mrs. Alvarez reached for Benny, who had been asleep and now stirred unhappily. Victor Reynolds closed his laptop lid halfway. Not all the way, just halfway, the gesture of a man who acknowledges the turbulence but refuses to fully capitulate to it. Danielle reached for the armrest. Malik was watching the ceiling. Specifically, he was watching the panel near row 22, because when the first wave of turbulence hit, that initial shudder, that rolling shift, the sound he'd been tracking for the last hour had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would penetrate the ambient noise of a cabin full of people adjusting to turbulence. But Malik had been so tuned to it by this point, had spent so much concentrated attention on its specific pitch and rhythm, that when it changed, he felt it as clearly as you feel a change in a song you've been listening to for an hour. The sound had gone from intermittent to continuous. Small detail, potentially enormous consequence. He reached for his mother's arm. "Mom, it's okay, baby. Just turbulence. We're fine. It's not the turbulence." He kept his voice low. The sound changed. Danielle looked at him. Again, that calibration process. Reading his face, taking the temperature of his concern. This time the reading came back higher. "What do you mean?" It was stopping and starting before. Now it's not stopping. Danielle looked toward row 22. The panel was right there. She could see it from her seat if she leaned slightly. She could not hear the specific sound Malik was describing over the general cabin noise. She was not Malik. She did not have his precision of attention, but she had spent 8 years learning to trust it. And here is where the story asks something difficult of her, because Danielle was already navigating so much social weight on this flight. She was a black woman traveling alone with her child, which in the United States in 2024 comes with its own invisible additional weight. The constant low-level awareness of how you're perceived, how you're being read, whether the space you're taking up is being judged. She had already had one interaction with Heather that had landed in that uncomfortable gray zone where professionalism and dismissal can look almost identical. Going back again required something from her. But she looked at her son's face, and she went. She caught Heather in the aisle. She was steadying herself against the seat back as another wave of turbulence rolled through. "Excuse me. I'm sorry. I know you addressed this before, but Malik is saying the sound has changed, that it went from intermittent to constant." Heather looked at her with that particular brand of patience that is indistinguishable from condescension. "Ma'am, during turbulence, all sorts of sounds in the cabin can change. The aircraft is entirely safe. I need you to remain seated with your seatbelt fastened." "Of course," Danielle said. "I just wanted to." "I understand," Heather said. "We're monitoring everything." She moved on. And 2 rows back, Victor Reynolds looked up from his laptop. He had heard that exchange. Both of them, the first one 40 minutes ago, and this one. And Victor Reynolds was, whatever his flaws in this story, whatever the assumptions he had made at boarding, a man who paid attention to patterns. That was how he built what he'd built. And the pattern here was same family, same concern, repeated. In his professional experience, repeated concerns either meant irrational anxiety or signal. And this child's face, what he could see of it from his angle, did not look like anxiety. It looked like calculation. Victor had a daughter. She was 14 now. She had been, at 8, also the kind of child who noticed things, who would tell him something in that specific tone and almost always be right. He had learned to listen to that tone. He had learned it, in fact, the hard way. From the time he hadn't listened, and she had been right, and he had sat with the consequence of that for much longer than he liked to admit. He looked at the panel near row 22. He looked at the aisle where Heather had just been. He unclipped his seatbelt. The seatbelt sign was technically on, which meant he wasn't supposed to do this, which tells you something about the strength of the pull he was feeling. And he leaned forward. "Hey," he said quietly, toward row 24, toward the Johnson family. Danielle looked back, guarded. "The kid," Victor said. "What exactly is he hearing?" There was a moment, a breath of a moment, where Danielle decided whether to engage with this man who had been nothing but implicitly dismissive since boarding. But she thought about Malik. She thought about the fact that she needed more people listening, not fewer. "He says there's a sound coming from near that overhead panel," she said. She pointed. "Row 22, right side. He says it was intermittent before. Now it's continuous." Victor looked at the panel. He looked at it for a long time. Then he pulled out his phone and went very quiet, in the specific way of someone doing rapid research. Meanwhile, Malik had not moved. His hands were still folded. His eyes were on the ceiling. He was tracking the sound with the focused attention of someone who had decided that attention itself was the most useful thing he could offer right now. The turbulence rolled through again. Bigger this time. Benny started crying in 23A. Drink cups slid. Overhead bins rattled. And in the rattling, in that loud, disorganized, turbulence-driven cacophony, Malik heard something that had not been there before. Not the continuous sound. Something underneath it. Something that happened once, fast, during the biggest shake of that turbulence wave. Like a seal breaking. Like pressure evening out where pressure should not be evening out. He turned to his mother. And for the first time in this entire flight, for the first time in all of this, his voice had something new in it. Still calm. Still controlled. But with a weight underneath it that Danielle felt immediately. "Mom," he said, "I need you to get the flight attendant again. Not ask. Get." Danielle looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. She stood up, and Victor Reynolds, watching from row 25, closed his laptop all the way. Heather Collins was at the back of the section when Danielle reached her. And Danielle, who had been deferential, who had been careful, who had spent 40 minutes managing the social dynamics of the situation with infinite patience, dropped all of that. Because her son had told her to get, not ask, and she knew exactly what that meant. "I need you to come look at that panel. Right now. Please." Heather's professionalism flickered into something firmer. "Ma'am, the seatbelt sign is... My son said something happened. Right now. Please." It was the please that got through. Something about the precise combination of her tone. The urgency that couldn't be faked, the please that wasn't submissive but was sincere, made Heather pause. Made her look, not at the situation, but at Danielle's face. And what she saw, there was not hysteria, not irrational fear. What she saw was a woman who knew something. She came, and as she walked toward row 22, Victor Reynolds stood up too and followed. 3 adults and 1 small boy looking at a panel in the ceiling of a pressurized aircraft at 31,000 feet. Only one of them knew exactly what they were looking for, and he was 8 years old. If you've been watching this from the beginning, you know what's coming. Subscribe so you don't lose this video and drop a like because we are arriving at the moment this whole story has been building toward. Right? Now, your question for this act: what do you do when you have a gut feeling about something and everyone around you is telling you you're wrong? Do you push forward or let it go? Real answers only. Tell me in the comments. ACT 5. Heather Collins looked at the panel. She looked at it with 11 years of professional experience and genuine competence and the specific frameworks built by those 11 years. And she said, "That looks normal to me." And she almost left it there. She almost turned around and walked back to her station and filed this entire episode under anxious passenger and overimaginative child, and continued with her job, which had 17 other things in it that needed attention right now given that the turbulence was still rolling through in waves and Benny Alvarez was fully crying and 2 passengers in rows 17 and 18 had their hands up for service. She almost did that, but Victor Reynolds was standing at her shoulder. And Victor Reynolds said, "What about the fit?" Heather looked at him. "Excuse me, the panel, the fit." The kid said it wasn't flush during boarding. "Look at the right edge." Heather looked. Victor was 2 inches taller than her and had a slightly different angle, and Heather had been looking at the panel surface, at the visible face of it, at the paint and the seam and the standard visual markers of normalcy. She had not been looking at the right edge. She looked at the right edge, and the right edge, very slightly, barely visible, the kind of thing you need to know to look for in order to see, was not quite flush. Not dramatically, not in a way that screamed emergency. But it was there, a gap that should not technically exist, small enough to miss in routine inspection, small enough that if Malik Johnson had not pointed at it through his mother, through Victor Reynolds, through Heather's own pride and professionalism and bias, if that chain of communication had broken at any link, it would still be there, invisible, doing whatever it was doing. Heather's hand went to her radio, and that's when it got complicated, because Heather calling it in, Heather radioing the galley, radioing the cockpit, meant acknowledging that something warranted checking, which meant acknowledging the thing she had dismissed twice now warranted checking, which is a hard thing for anyone to do, but particularly hard in a professional context at altitude, with 12 rows of passengers watching you figure out whether you made a mistake. And she hesitated, just a moment, just long enough for Malik to notice. He was standing now. He had gotten up when his mother did, because he was not the kind of child who stays seated when something important is happening in front of him. He was standing in the aisle of row 24, small enough that the overhead bins were well above his head, and he was watching Heather's hand on a radio. "You should call," he said. Heather looked at him, and this was the moment, the title moment, the moment the story has been waiting to arrive at, where she had a choice, where the story she had written about this situation, about this child, about what kind of person knows things on airplane and what kind of person doesn't, where all of that could be revised or reinforced. She could tell him to go sit down. She could tell him, gently but firmly, that she had this handled, that this was adult business, that he should let the professionals do their jobs. She almost did that too. But Victor Reynolds said, very quietly, so that only Heather and the immediate row could hear, "My daughter's 14. When she was 8, she told me the brakes on my car sounded wrong. I thought she was repeating something she heard on TV. I took the car to a mechanic 3 weeks later. He said another week, and they would have failed completely." Silence. The specific silence that happens when someone says exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. Heather's thumb pressed the radio call button. "This is Collins in Section B. I need Captain Morris to be aware of a potential panel irregularity at row 22, starboard side overhead. I'd like maintenance protocol guidance." Static. Then the calm, immediate voice of the cockpit. "Copy that, Collins. Where are you looking at?" And as Heather began to describe it, panel fit, intermittent sound reported by passenger, now continuous, the specific location. Malik listened to her describe it, and he heard her get every detail right. He heard her relay what he had told his mother, who had told Heather, who had almost not listened, but was now listening perfectly. And then Captain Morris said something that made Heather go very still, something that changed the texture of the air in Section B of that aircraft in a way that every nearby passenger felt, even the ones who hadn't been paying attention, because bodies know. Bodies read the energy of a room, even a room at 31,000 feet, with a sensitivity that the rational mind is always trying to talk itself out of. Captain Morris said, "That panel covers the main secondary electrical junction for rows 19 through 26. We've had a monitoring light on that section since departure that we flagged as a sensor error. In light of what you're describing, I want the senior technician to check it manually. We may be looking at a genuine fault." And Heather Collins stood very still in the aisle of Section B and looked at an 8-year-old boy who had been trying to tell her this for an hour. She had to hold his gaze for a moment. She held it, and then the intercom clicked on. Captain Morris's voice, now addressing the cabin. Still calm. That pilot's cadence. But now, with a different layer, a layer of directness that passengers learn to hear as "pay attention." Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. As a precaution, we're going to be making a slight adjustment to our flight plan today. Our crew has identified a panel they'd like our maintenance team to take a look at on the ground, and we've received clearance from Regional Air Traffic Control to divert to a nearby facility where we can take care of that comfortably. This is a precautionary measure and nothing that should cause any concern. We expect only a brief delay, and we appreciate your patience. The cabin absorbed this. The way cabins absorb unexpected news, that held breath, that ripple of whispered conversation, that collective recalibration of plans and connections, and the controlled anxiety of 200 people reassessing the situation they're in. And in row 24, Danielle Johnson closed her eyes for one moment. One moment of something that was not relief yet, because the full weight of what might have been versus what was caught hadn't fully arrived yet. That would come later, on the ground, when her legs were on solid earth, and her mother's voice was on the phone, and Malik was eating something at an airport restaurant, and she had a quiet moment to sit with the arithmetic of this afternoon. For now, she just closed her eyes. One breath. Then she opened them and looked at her son. He was already looking at her. "You good?" she asked. Their private question, their household phrase, the way they checked in with each other. "Yeah," Malik said. He sat back down, folded his hands in his lap, looked out the window, like it was done, like the thing he needed to do had been done, and now it was just the business of landing. That's who he was. That's always who he had been. Keep watching. We are not done yet, because the plane hasn't landed, and the story doesn't end at the diversion announcement. What happens when they get on the ground? What happens in the gate area? What happens between these people when they're no longer in the air is the part of this story that is going to stay with you the longest. Subscribe if you haven't yet. We're almost there. Comment right now. Who in your life, at any age, do you wish you had listened to sooner? You don't have to say why. Just say who. I'll read every single one. ACT 6. The airport they diverted to was a regional hub, not the destination. 40 miles south of it, smaller, the kind of airport with 2 runways and a terminal that feels less like a transportation hub and more like a large, well-lit waiting room. They landed without incident, which is, given the circumstances, the most important sentence in this story. They landed without incident. The maintenance team was waiting, and here's what they found. The secondary electrical junction panel at rows 19 to 26, starboard overhead. The panel that had not been fully flushed since before boarding. The panel that a maintenance crew had done a standard pre-flight check on and had not flagged because the irregularity was within a tolerance window that standard visual inspection does not. Catch. The panel was, in fact, compromised. The seal on the junction housing had a stress fracture. Hairline. Invisible to a standard walkthrough. The kind of damage that accumulates incrementally, that builds over time, that goes undetected until the conditions are exactly right. And Turbulence, as it turned out, had been exactly right. The sound Malik had been tracking was the fracture widening under pressure differential. The change from intermittent to continuous that he had reported to his mother during the turbulence was the fracture fully propagating, completing itself. The senior maintenance technician on the ground told Captain Morris privately, in the kind of language that maintenance technicians use when they're trying to be honest without being theatrical. Another hour under those stress conditions, we would have been looking at a full junction failure. Best case, you lose power to rows 19 to 26. Entertainment systems, reading lights, the environmental controls for that section. Worst case, and then he had not finished that sentence. He hadn't needed to. Captain Morris went back to talk to the passengers who were now in the gate area, sitting in plastic chairs, some on phones rerouting connections, some ordering coffee, all doing the particular recalibration of people who have landed somewhere they didn't plan to land. He found the Johnson family. Captain Morris was 61 years old. He had been flying commercial aircraft for 33 of those years. He had 6 grandchildren. He had, over 3 decades, seen a lot. Mechanical failures, near misses, weather events, medical emergencies at altitude, passenger crises of every imaginable variety. He was not a man given to sentimentality or performance. He was precise, direct, and genuinely humble in the way that people who deal in life-and-death precision tend to be. He found Danielle and Malik at a quiet end of the gate area. He crouched down to Malik's level, and he looked at this 8-year-old boy for a moment before he spoke. "Son," he said, "I need to tell you something man to man." Malik met his eyes. "What you noticed on that plane today, the sound, the smell, the panel, our maintenance team confirmed it. You were right. All three. And the right edge of that panel that you saw during boarding, that's what they used to locate the fault. If we hadn't known exactly where to look, it would have taken considerably longer." Malik was quiet for a moment. "Is everybody okay?" he asked. Captain Morris smiled. Not a big smile. A real one. "Everybody's okay," he said. "Because of you." Danielle's hand went to her mouth, and Captain Morris stood up and extended his hand to Danielle. "You raised somebody remarkable," he said. She could not respond for a moment. She nodded, and then, because Captain Morris was a thorough man, because he believed in full accountability, he went to find Heather Collins. Now, here is where this story does something that lesser stories don't do. Because Heather Collins, in another version of this story, the comfortable version, the version where the lesson is clean and the villain is clear, Heather Collins walks away quietly, and we boo her, and that's the end of her. But that's not what happened, and that's not who Heather was. Heather had been sitting in the gate agent's back office since they landed. She had been sitting there for 22 minutes, which is not long in calendar time, but is long in the specific way that minutes feel when you're sitting with something. She was sitting with the precise arithmetic of how close she had come to a different outcome. Not a catastrophic outcome, necessarily. Not a collision with history, but a meaningful, consequential, preventable problem that had been trying to announce itself through the voice of a child she had dismissed. Not once, twice, and she had dismissed it. She could see this clearly now, with the particular clarity that only comes after, not because Malik had been wrong, but because of where the information had come from, because of the package it arrived in. 8 years old, black, hoodie, economy row 24. That package had not matched her framework for person whose technical observation should be taken seriously at 31,000 feet. And she had acted on that mismatch. Twice. She knew what that was. She had always known, somewhere, that it was in her. She had not wanted to look at it directly. This afternoon had made looking at it directly non-optional. Captain Morris came in and sat with her for a few minutes. He said what needed to be said, which was not cruel and not soft. It was honest, the way he said everything. He told her about the maintenance team's findings. He told her what they would have been looking at in a worst-case scenario. He told her what the child had done. Then he said, "I think you should go find him." Heather sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up. She found the Johnson family near the coffee counter. Malik was eating a chocolate chip muffin and looking out the window at the tarmac, where their plane sat being worked on. Danielle looked up when she saw Heather coming, and her face did something careful and composed and waiting. Heather stopped in front of them. She looked at Malik. "Malik," she said, "not sweetie." His name. He looked up. "I want to say something to you," she said. "I want to apologize. I didn't listen to you when I should have. I made a decision about what kind of information you were likely to have before I actually found out what information you had. And that was wrong. I was wrong. And I'm sorry." She held his eyes while she said it. She didn't look at Danielle. She looked at Malik. Because it was Malik she had dismissed. It was Malik who deserved the apology directly, not adjacent to him, not through his mother. Malik looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "It's okay." Not a performance of forgiveness. Not a declaration. Just, "It's okay." The way you say it when you mean it simply. Heather nodded. She looked at Danielle, and in that look passed everything that couldn't be fully articulated in the middle of an airport gate area. The acknowledgement, the embarrassment, the sorrow, the respect. Danielle received it. And then Victor Reynolds was there. He had been standing a few feet back, waiting. Victor Reynolds, who had spent this afternoon being wrong in a quieter way than Heather. His dismissal more private. His recalibration more private too. He had no grand gesture to offer. He was not a grand gesture man. He was a man who built things through small, exact actions. He looked at Malik and he said, "You ever think about engineering?" Malik looked at him. "I like ocean science right now." Victor almost smiled. Almost. Fair enough, he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card. He held it out to Danielle. If that ever changes, he said, have him call me. Danielle took it, and Mrs. Alvarez, who had Benny on her hip and had been watching all of this from a row of seats nearby, came over and touched Danielle's arm and said something in a voice too low for the story to capture clearly. But whatever she said made Danielle nod and touch Mrs. Alvarez's hand briefly, and that was enough. That was enough. If this story had reached you, subscribe and share it, because the people around you need to hear this one. This asks question. Do you think Heather did the right thing by apologizing directly to Malik? Or do you think apologies in moments like this don't go far enough? Tell me what you think. ACT 7. They made it to Danielle's mother. Late. 3 hours and 40 minutes late. With a layover in a regional airport and a replacement flight, and the full weight of an afternoon that had become considerably more than an afternoon. But they made it. Danielle's mother was waiting. Her sister had called ahead when the diversion happened, because flight tracking apps have made it impossible to protect people from airport anxiety, which is sometimes a problem and sometimes a grace. So Danielle's mother knew something had happened. She didn't know what exactly. She knew her daughter and her grandson had landed somewhere unexpected. When they came through the arrival door, she was standing there, smaller than Danielle remembered, in the way people look smaller when time has been hard on them. But standing, eyes bright, arms open. Danielle walked into those arms and did not speak for a long moment. She just stood there, and her mother held her, and some of what she was carrying, the weight of the trip and its reason and what had happened in the air and the years of distance and silence and love that had been present but unexpressed, some of it moved through that hug and dissolved. Then Danielle's mother looked at Malik, and Malik looked at her. She said, "Come here, boy." He went, and she held him the way grandmothers hold, which is differently from the way anyone else holds, with a full-body conviction, with arms that have been waiting, with the specific warmth of someone who has been counting the days. On the flight later, when they were finally home, Danielle would tell people about what had happened. She would tell the story the way you tell a story that you're still metabolizing, carefully, with pauses where the weight lives, with a kind of wonder underneath the narrative that hasn't quite settled into past tense yet. She would tell it, and people would ask, wasn't he scared? Was he nervous? And she would say no. He was never scared. He was working, because that's who Malik was. He didn't experience danger as paralysis. He experienced it as a problem to be solved, a collection of information to be processed and communicated and acted on. He had been working carefully, persistently, without drama, from the moment he heard that first sound at the gate to the moment Heather pressed the radio button. And when it was over, when the work was done, he went back to being an 8-year-old eating a muffin and looking at a plane on the tarmac with the same focused attention he gave everything. Captain Morris, back at his home base 3 days later, filed a full incident report. In the narrative section, he wrote what had happened with complete precision. The passengers report, the initial dismissal, the repeat escalation, the manual investigation, the maintenance findings. He included the age and description of the original observer without editorializing. He let the facts be the story. Aviation safety boards and incident databases are full of moments where the difference between a near miss and something worse was a single human variable. In this case, the human variable was a child who paid attention and kept speaking even when he wasn't being heard. Heather Collins flew again the next week. She was the same flight attendant she had always been, efficient, professional, genuinely skilled at her job. But she was different in one specific way. When passengers spoke to her, all passengers, any passengers, she gave the second of attention, the one she hadn't been giving before, the one that lives between appearing to listen and actually listening. It's a small thing. It costs almost nothing. It can change everything. Victor Reynolds called his daughter that night. She was in the middle of homework and slightly annoyed at the interruption, but she stayed on the phone because her father didn't call in the middle of the week without reason. He told her about the flight. He told her what the boy had noticed and what it had meant. And his daughter, who was 14 and therefore contractually obligated not to be impressed by things her father found meaningful, went quiet in a way that meant she was actually listening. Then she said, "Dad, I've been telling you for 2 months that something sounds weird in my car. Victor closed his eyes. I'll take it in tomorrow, he said. She took it in the next day. The wheel bearing was worn. Another month, the mechanic said, and it could have caused a serious problem. Victor Reynolds sat with that for a while. And Malik Johnson went to school the following Monday and did not mention any of it. His teacher asked how his trip was, the standard question, the question asked of all returning students with the professional warmth of people who understand that connection is part of education. Malik said, "We visited my grandma. She's sick, but she's still really funny. She told us 3 jokes at dinner that I didn't fully get, but my mom laughed a lot." His teacher smiled. "That sounds like a great trip." It was, Malik said. And then he sat down and opened his book about deep-sea creatures and began to read. And in his mind, perhaps, beneath the pages about bioluminescence and pressure and the extraordinary creatures that live in depths where light cannot reach, in the deep, quiet parts of his thinking, he was already noticing, already listening, already filing things away. That's what he did. That's what he'd always done. That's what some people are built for. Not the loudness of proclamation, not the spotlight of recognition, but the quiet, steady, invaluable work of paying attention when everyone else has learned to look away. The world needs more Maliks. In boardrooms, in classrooms, on flights, and in families, in the places where we've gotten so comfortable with our frameworks that we've stopped asking whether the framework fits. The world needs more of what he was. And maybe this story is a reminder to be more of what he was too. To listen. To actually listen. Before the radio has to get pressed. Before the maintenance team has to be called. Before the moment of crisis becomes the only thing loud enough to make us pay attention to the voice we should have heard before. Wisdom has no age. Awareness has no appearance. And sometimes, the smallest voice in a room is the one saying exactly what needs to be said. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. Thank you for watching this entire story. If it moved you, if it made you think about someone in your life, a kid, a quieter colleague, a person who keeps getting talked over, share this video with them. Leave it in their messages. Let them know someone made a whole hour about why their voice matters. Subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell so you get every story we tell here. And drop your final comment below. Final question, and I want you to really think about this one. Who in your life do you need to listen to more? Not more patiently, more genuinely, more completely. Who keeps saying something and you keep hearing it but not actually listening? You don't have to name them. Just say, "I know who it is." And let that be the thing you carry out of this video today.